My name is Andrew Biggs. I'm a resident scholar at AEI. This has really been a collaborative effort that's gone on over the past maybe year or so between Jason Richwine of the Heritage Foundation and I. And it's unusual you get these sort of collaborations between think tanks, but I think it's nice to see this going on. Although I'll admit this began when Jason was still at AEI, and now he's switched over to Heritage. But it's proven to be, I think, a fruitful line of work, and one where I definitely say that work continues. Even, I think on your chairs they gave an article from the Weekly Standard from a couple weeks ago. Even since then, we've refined the estimates, gotten better estimates. I mean, it's a real challenge to try to get these numbers right, because you're dealing with multiple data sources. You're trying to control for a range of different factors. But I think what we have now is a decent approximation of where things stand. And what we're trying to get at with the issues is really, our public sector workers, in this case federal workers, are they compensated fairly relative to what those people would get if they worked in the private sector? That's the question you're trying to get at. So I think the basic division of labor on this has generally been that Jason's worked more on the salary end. I've tended to work more on the benefits end. You see there's a whole range of issues with each of those. So I think what I'm going to do, we're going to start with salaries. I'm going to pass it off to Jason. He's going to run through those issues. Then we'll come back and I'll talk about benefits and some other stuff. We'll wrap up and then hopefully get some good questions from you guys. So Jason, you want to start things off? Sure. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew. And thanks to AEI for putting this on. I think this is an issue that has had its time come, I think, for reform. And the title page is gone now. Can you go back to the title page? An in-depth analysis of the data, that's really our main purpose here, is that for those of you who are congressional staffers or in some way associated with policymaking, what we want to do is give you sort of the background and the basis to begin looking at some fundamental reforms. So, next slide. If I could just outline the debate for you that's been going on for the past year or so. You know, I guess federal pay has always been a controversy to some degree since we've had a federal government, but it seems like within the past year or so, the issue really seemed to come to a head during the 2010 presidential campaign. There's a variety of reasons for that. One is just the budgetary pressures that the government's facing, severe budget deficits in the future, and the need for sort of fundamental reforms in that area. And I think a lot of us have been disappointed with the president's statements on Social Security and Medicaid not really coming out with any specific plan to solve those problems. So federal pay is a budget issue to begin with. But it's also more of a psychological issue to a lot of Americans, especially coming out of a recession. The recession is technically over now, but a lot of Americans are still feeling the pain of it, especially because the recovery has not been as robust as we would expect it to be from such a deep recession. And there is a perception, again, it doesn't even necessarily matter if it's the truth in this case, but there's the perception that public sector employees might be overpaid or getting some kind of special deal, special privileges that they get simply because they happen to work for the federal government. That kind of perception, again, real or imagined, is not good for democracy. It's not good for people to think that there is someone who's taking their tax money and not using it for the public good as best it could be. So that's kind of why I think people are very interested in the topic. But of course, perception is one thing and truth is another. So you have to ask yourself, well, are federal employees actually overpaid? You can put overpaid in quotes if you like. What we mean by that is, do they receive a wage premium over private sector workers who have the same skills and characteristics? Well, Republican politicians and some conservative activists have said yes, strong yes, during over the summer and during the campaign. And you've had OPM, that's the Office of Personnel Management, and a lot of unions saying absolutely not, it's totally a myth, it's not something people should be talking about. Well, who's right? The question is harder to answer than you might think. That's why we have a whole presentation on it. If you go to the next slide, you have. Why answering the question is hard? Well, the most basic reason why it's a hard question to answer is just that the federal government is not a market actor. It's not checked by market forces the way the private sector is. This is kind of elementary, but basically, the reason private sectors, establish wages where they do is because that's what they can do in order to stay in business. They can't raise wages too high, otherwise they go out of business. And even private sector labor unions know this. They know they can't push their employers too far because then they'd be biting the hand that feeds them, so to speak. So the federal government doesn't face that kind of restriction. It's really the only check on its power is taxpayer outrage, essentially. So there's certainly the chance for federal salaries to outstrip private sector salaries without that kind of immediate market correction you would see, or hopefully see, with the private sector. Now, there are also some other problems here, notably that federal and private jobs are not the same, nor are federal and private workers. In terms of jobs, certainly there are some jobs that would seem to be very comparable. A secretary, for example, in the private sector probably does basically the same work as a secretary in the federal sector. But nevertheless, there are certainly some jobs that sort of lack private sector analogs. So an FBI agent, for example, or a diplomat. And these are people, it would be difficult to know exactly what the accompanying private sector job would be in that case. But even more importantly is the differences in the differences in workers themselves. Now, I should digress a little bit here and mention that there have been some kind of overzealous critics of federal pay who have basically done the following analysis, and USA Today is kind of guilty of this, just to name names, is to say, okay, let's look at the average compensation for a federal worker, and they do that, wages plus benefits. It's something like $120,000 a year. And then they say, what's the average compensation for a private sector worker? And it's like $60,000 a year. And they say, oh, so, case closed. So they might say it implicitly or even explicitly that federal workers make double what they should. Okay. But you can see the problem with that in that federal and private workers are not the same in terms of their skills. And in fact, federal workers actually are more experienced and more educated than the average private sector worker. Remember, I'm talking about averages here. So in a sense, we would expect federal workers to make more money than private sector workers. We would hope they would if they're being paid the way they would if they worked in the private sector. Sometimes, though, what happens is people just sort of end the debate right there. Someone says federal workers are overpaid. Someone else says yes, but they're more educated, and then we just kind of stop talking about it. But the real question is, by how much should federal workers be paid more than private sector workers? That's the real question we want to try to answer today. The last problem with this kind of analysis is the lack of comprehensive data. I think Andrew already alluded to this in his introduction, that particularly for benefits, not so much for wages, but for benefits, you oftentimes have to sort of piece together parts of the puzzle from various sources. There's not some single data set we can look at that just kind of say, there's the answer, crunch numbers, there it is. So this is not an easy topic, but we have come to some conclusions that are pretty well supported by the academic literature. The short story is that in terms of wages, federal workers make about 14% more than private sector workers who have the same comparable skills and other characteristics. In terms of benefits, again, this is a little harder to pin down, depends on the assumptions, but our best estimate right now is about 32% premium in benefits for comparable private sector workers. And you also have job security. And the job security is interesting because everyone kind of understands that public workers tend to have more job security than private workers. In fact, it's actually very unusual for a federal government worker to lose his job through layoffs or firing. Well, that kind of job security has real economic value. And if you try to put numbers on it, you quickly discover that it has a lot of economic value. So we've tried to quantify that and add it into the comparison just to make sure that it's a fair comparison. You might ask, what does it all add up to? Well, that's what you have to wait till the end of the presentation to see. So you can't leave early. Okay, so let's talk first about wages. So not benefits, just wages right now. And you might be surprised to learn that OPM actually does an annual comparison of wages, of federal and private wages each year. And it comes to the surprising conclusion that federal workers are 25% underpaid compared to private sector workers. Now, this might be surprising to you or may not be. It was surprising to me to see that this kind of conclusion would be drawn. And from a sheer gut level plausibility perspective, it suffers a bit. The reason being that 25% underpayment suggests taking 75 cents on the dollar. Sheer patriotism alone is probably not sufficient to explain why someone would take a federal government job rather than a private sector job, especially because federal jobs as a percentage of all the jobs in America is rather small. But even leaving aside the sort of gut level sort of reaction to it, there's a reason why virtually every labor economist rejects this method as sort of woefully insufficient to look at wages. And I'll explain why that is in a minute. But first, a brief discussion of what OPM actually does. If you look at the description of the procedure OPM uses, it's very long and very complicated. And It's not the easiest thing to understand, even for me, and someone who's looked at it a lot. But nevertheless, I can certainly give you the essentials of what they do. The important thing to understand is that they don't compare workers. They compare types of jobs, all right? And what they basically do is take a large private sector survey of jobs across the country, and they kind of pigeonhole into those jobs what sort of GS level, general schedule level you would have if that job were a federal government job. So they take a lawyer and say, what's your job description? How many people are working for you, and so forth. And say, okay, that sounds like a GS-13, right? And once they do that, and I think they do that sort of within 5 broad occupational categories, once they do that, then it becomes kind of easy to compare federal and private jobs. So you just take a real GS-13 in the federal government, compare it to the alleged GS-13 in the private sector, compare the wages, and there you go. And when they do that, as I said, they find pretty much year after year about the 25% underpayment. Now, there's subjectivity, of course, that could be a problem here. Is it really a GS-12 or a GS-14 that they're dealing with in the private sector? But the real problem, the real reason why economists almost universally reject this method is that it ignores the skills of workers who are holding the jobs. So I think we can all sort of understand that even at a given level of job in the private sector, there's a very large variation in wages. And the reason for that, of course, is that even if 2 people are holding the same job, one could possess a lot more skills than the other and therefore deserve a higher wage, because presumably he's using those skills to be more productive. And that's what we found is happening with the federal government. In fact, actually, to be more specific, the CBO has found that this has been happening, and that if you actually take a given job level in the federal government compared to the private sector, the federal government tends to have less experienced and less educated people in those particular jobs compared to the private sector. So we like to use the example of the senior accountant and the junior accountant, okay? So a senior accountant in the federal government will, on average, likely be less experienced and less educated than a senior accountant in the private sector. In fact, that senior accountant in the federal government probably would only qualify as a junior accountant in the private sector. So this has a lot of implications for the method. Basically, what it means is that although OPM could be correct in the sense that the jobs themselves are underpaid, there's quite a good reason for that. That is that the people holding those jobs have different skills. So the jobs could be underpaid, but the employees themselves could be overpaid. That's a really important point to keep in mind here. And anyone who's doing any kind of work on reforming pay has to understand why the OPM's method differs so much from the economist's method. And this is the best explanation we have for that right now. Just to say one more time, anytime any academic economist does an analysis like this, they don't do OPM's method for all the reasons I've described. What they do is they compare workers. So let me go to the next slide. To compare the wages of workers, they create an apples-to-apples comparison by basically controlling for all worker characteristics that they can. So they use regression analysis, I should say. Regression is sort of a basic econometric technique that every economist knows, and it allows you to control for everything in your data set. So if you take the same worker in the private sector who has the same skills, same characteristics as a federal government worker, then you can do an apples-to-apples comparison which accounts for skills, unlike the OPM method. I should just point out that this is a method that is very common and has been used not just to compare federal and private pay, but to compare the pay of whites and blacks and men and women. These are analyses that try to figure out what portion of the pay gap among, say, whites and blacks is due to discrimination versus observable characteristics. So economists have been comparing federal and private pay this way for really about 30 years at this point. And what they found has been a pretty consistent finding. It's about a 10 to 20% wage premium for federal workers, very different from the OPM results. And of course, the old story, you can't get 2 economists to agree on anything. This is one of the more consistent findings in the literature going over 3 decades now, that you really often get that 10 to 20% range. And what does that mean? Well, basically it means that you take a federal worker with the same skills as a private worker, and for every dollar the private sector worker makes, the federal worker gets about $1.10 to $1.20.
Now, OPM says that according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, federal employees actually earn 22% less for comparable jobs.
Comparable jobs, right.
Are you accusing the Bureau of Labor Statistics of comparing jobs to jobs, or are you accusing OPM of misconstruing BLS data?
No. There's no misconstruing here. OPM is quite accurate in its description of what the whole process is. It is a job-to-job comparison. There's no false claim that they're really comparing worker to worker.
So you're saying that DLS doesn't collect relevant data with respect to worker to worker?
That's right. They need more data on workers rather than jobs.
DLS data, not OPM.
Well, OPM sort of directs sort of a collection of bureaucracies that are involved in this. I think something called the Federal Salary Council is also.
What academics are you citing here?
The academic work would be best to cite would come from the Handbook of Labor Economics.
If we could hold the questions until the end, we definitely want to clarify this, but I don't want
Okay. Well, just to answer that question. The 10 to 20% wage premium we're referencing comes from the Handbook of Labor Economics. It's a chapter on comparing government pay. And there's a whole list, actually it'd be good to, maybe we can, you've linked to this in a blog post at one point. Yeah. Right, you can see the list of studies, you can see the range for yourself, it's about 10 to 20%. So what we did is basically just replicated that particular analysis. Again, nothing fancy, just the standard methodology. And we replicated it because we wanted the most recent data, which would be from 2006 to 2010. The last 5 years, we combined that from what's called the CPS, the Current Population Survey. That's something published by the Census Bureau. It's a monthly survey that provides a lot of the unemployment data and things for the government. Now, the control variables we used is extensive. It's as many control variables as we could find in the CPS. So you have sort of your direct control variables like experience and education. Also some indirect control variables that are in every economist regression. Race, gender, marital status, those sorts of things. Obviously, they're not direct measures of skill, but oftentimes they say something indirectly about it. For example, women have less labor force attachment, so that might affect productivity, and therefore we control for it, as does every other economist. Also, there's a cost of living issue here, state of residence versus city, suburb, rural status. Obviously, there's a high cost of living in Washington, D.C., so we don't want to unfairly compare D.C. workers to people who live in South Dakota. So we control for state of residence, whether you live in the city or not. We put in 10 broad occupational categories and also firm size. Now, there's a little asterisk next to firm size. And if there was anything at all controversial about this specification, it would be involving firm size. So let me just explain what I mean by that. It's not an especially appreciated fact that in the private sector, larger firms tend to pay more, even controlling for everything else. If you take the same person in a small company, and move him to a large company, you will see typically a large wage increase for that person, just because of the firm size itself. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. The federal government is a very large firm, so to speak. So the question is, do we want to compare workers in a large firm to the federal government, or workers in all size firms in the private sector to the federal government? Well, it depends a lot on why we think there is this large firm premium in the private sector. There's good arguments you can make on either side of that issue. We've come to the conclusion it's probably better to control for firm size than not to. But please note that because we're controlling for firm size, we're making the federal premium smaller than otherwise would be. If we did not control for firm size, it would be higher because we'd be including smaller firms which pay less. Just a quick note. There was a previous Heritage Foundation study very similar to this one. It was by my colleague there, James Shirk, and he chose not to control for firm size, which is perfectly defensible, just not the way we decided to do it. But if you're looking for, what's the major difference between the Biggs-Richwine study and the Shirk study, it's the firm size issue. Okay. I should also point out that we try to control for firm size as best we can in the benefits literature, which comes a little later. So you can see the result here. The 14% number is what we came up with for these past 5 years. And we think that's probably a better estimate than just taking 1 year because you get sort of the trends. It's important to understand that this premium is not uniform, that the premium depends on education and experience. So one of the things that's happened with federal pay, as you all know probably, is that President Obama has imposed a wage freeze, or at least a cost of living freeze. And we're not against that, that's okay, but the fact is, there are some people in the federal government who are not overpaid, in fact might even be underpaid. The premium tends to rise with experience. So the federal government tends to pay people, tends to reward experience more than the private sectors. As you're there, the premium goes up. But it falls with education. meaning that if you're someone with just a high school diploma, you receive a very large premium. But if you're someone with a PhD, you may not get any premium at all. In fact, you might even be underpaid depending on the job you're doing. In fact, one of the most frequent emails we get whenever we do a public presentation or even just a published article is from someone who works in the federal government and says, how can what you're saying possibly be true? I work for the federal government. I know what my colleagues in the private sector make. They make more than I do. How is this possible? Well, it almost always turns out the person emailing us is a chemical engineer at NIH, right? It is very likely they are not receiving a premium. So it's important when we do any kind of reform to really pay close attention to who we're looking at here. Well, the 14% is an average. So we go to the next slide. Now, this is a slightly different way of looking at wages. The previous slide talked about the cross-section, which is just a single point in time looking at workers. You can also look at wages from a longitudinal perspective, meaning watching the same workers over time. And it's interesting because some people switch from the private sector to the public sector. And when they do that, we can observe how their wages change. The advantage of this process is that you can basically control for many unobservable traits. You can't control necessarily for motivation or extroversion or intelligence, for example. But if you're following the same people over time, that's built into the controls. Now, the drawback of this kind of analysis is you can't follow people very long. So you get a small sample size, and you don't get to observe the overall premium which would come about from long tenure in the federal government. But we can estimate the premium upon switching, which we would expect to be lower than the overall premium. And when people do that, they typically find something in the range of 6 to 12%, depending on the data set they choose. We replicated this with the 2004 and 2008 panels of the Survey of Income and Program Participation. And we think that's actually probably the best way of doing it. It's the largest data set, it's the most representative. And we found a number right now at 9%, right in the middle of that range. So again, this premium that you get upon switching into the government, which I think confirms the past analysis, and in many ways I think is more convincing because it's the same person being moved rather than the different people at one point in time. So that's wages, and you'll notice that there are some decent data sets for this, micro level data sets where you see individual people. And that way you can actually do all the controls you want, and it's a pretty decent result that you get. Benefits are a little muddier. You have to sort of grab the puzzle pieces and put them together. And we've been Googling and finding OPM memos and things, putting together the information. And I think at this point, especially Andrew, who's looked into this the most, I think he really actually has put together, I think, the best analysis of benefits that I've seen. And I will let him explain it to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Jason. In addition, benefits are important because in addition to salaries, people receive a number of non-wage benefits. These include things like paid leave, which is sick time, vacation time, holidays. What we call supplemental pay, which is a category that BLS includes, which includes things like overtime pay, cash bonuses, things like that. Various forms of insurance, which is principally health insurance and life insurance policies that employers offer. Pensions, which is traditional defined benefit pensions, defined contribution, which means 401k type pensions, and what they call payments to government programs, which is employer taxes paid on behalf of the employee. So the employer pays part of your Social Security taxes, Medicare, unemployment insurance, disability, or workers' comp insurance, things like that. The tricky thing, can we get the next slide, please? The tricky thing with benefits is that on the salary end, we have individual level data. From the current population survey, we have, Joe Smith earns this amount in salary, and he has all these different personal characteristics. He has a college degree, he's married, he's this age, all these other things, and so forth. For benefits, that sort of data basically doesn't exist. All the data comes not from the individual employee side, but from the employer side, where there's survey data or other reports of how much do employers pay towards their employee benefits. That makes it tougher to do the types of analysis we'd like to do, because we'd like to say how much benefits do you get controlling for all these different personal characteristics. We can't really do that. So you have a certain level of approximation. The one advantage, though, is a lot of benefits are paid on a more or less flat basis. That if you're a federal employee, for instance, you get a certain health insurance plan, you all take part in the same pension plans. So there's a certain level of approximation we can make there, but it is admittedly a tougher thing to get on top of. We've been spending a lot of time lately looking at this. At the state and local, or at the private sector level, and for state and local government workers, the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects and publishes benefits data on a whole range of different benefit types. That makes it kind of easy. I can say, well, in the state and local sector, they generally receive pensions equal to X% of their salaries, where in the private sector, pensions are only equal to Y% of their salaries. That's easy to do. For whatever reason, BLS does not publish those figures for the federal government. So that makes our job harder. So there's a certain kind of forensic aspect to this, to dig around and pick up data where you can and try to put it together. What we have here today is, I think is the best attempt I've seen at putting this stuff together. And it's not because I'm a particular genius, it's because I found some good data sources. You just spend a lot of time rooting around, looking for the kinds of numbers that you need. Essentially, the process I followed is I looked at BLS benefit data for private sector workers and for state and local government workers, and I essentially filled in the blanks for federal workers. I used the same categories that BLS uses for private sector employees, and I said, how do I fill that in using different data sources for federal workers? Those data sources included OMB cost factors, Office of Management and Budget, that they use for outsourcing purposes. These cover costs for pensions, life and health insurance, and payroll taxes. Using OPM data, I was able to fill in most of the rest. Costs in terms of paid leave, overtime, and all the rest. I also had to make an adjustment to the implicit compensation that comes from defined benefit pensions. The reason here is that defined benefit pensions, there's two things going on. There's the amount your employer contributes to the pension, and then there's an implicit rate of return on the pension, which is usually higher than what is paid in the private sector. So when we're looking here with this data, we're looking at what employers contribute towards these plans. What you really want to know is what will the employee eventually collect from the plan. So I had to make some adjustments there, and that matters quite a bit at the federal and state and local end. As with the salaries, we compared benefits for private sector workers in large private firms. The largest category they had is 500 workers and up. Large firms pay the most generous benefits, so the benefits I'm reporting here on the private sector end will tend to be the most generous. If we were to not control for firm size and say, let's control for let's compare to benefits for the private sector in general, they'd be lower, and the benefit premium for federal workers would be higher. Well, there we go. This slide looks at how we've worked out the different categories. The total measure here is fringe benefits as a % of salary. So if you had total fringe benefits equal to, say, 50% of your salary, it means that if you had a salary of $100,000 per year, your benefits for that year will be worth around $50,000. This is just a way of measuring it, trying to make it comparable. Sure.
What does the employer cost for these benefits?
That's correct. So things like employee contributions are not counted here for, say, 401k or TSP, things like that. So this slide kind of tries to explain how the different benefit categories are broken down. For instance, from OPM data, they explain that the average federal worker uses around 20 days of annual leave per year, gets 9 paid holidays, around 9.5 sick days. The total value of this is around 16.5% of pay. For private sector workers in large firms, total paid time off equals around 12.8% of pay. So in other words, on the paid time off category, federal workers receive around 30% more than private sector workers in large firms. Likewise, in the supplemental pay, which includes overtime, bonuses, a number of other subcategories, federal workers receive around not quite twice as much supplemental pay as private sector employees. The big place where the private sector is more generous is when the category insurance plans. That's mostly health insurance. Despite the view that federal employees get this gold-plated health insurance policy, the federal health insurance policy is worth about 6.8% of employee pay, where in the private sector, health costs are actually a lot higher. So that's one area where the private sector gives more compensation to workers. But that's really swamped when you come to what we call the retirement and savings category. The contributions for federal pensions come to somewhere around, for the defined benefit pension, comes to around 14% of salary. On top of that, you have contributions for the employer's contribution to the federal thrift savings plan, the defined contribution part, and you have the cost of retiree health benefits. The pensions end, it just simply swamps the private sector. It's basically around 3 times more as a percent of salary. In terms of legally required benefits, I think they come out around a wash. It's not clear, but the 2% of pay going to other benefits, I think. It's not specified in the OMB memo, but I think that is payment for things like unemployment insurance and all that. If you add that to the legally required benefits category, they come out around the same. If you put them all together, don't go yet, back up. If you put them all together, federal employees receive total benefits that are equal to around 66% of their pay. Private sector workers in large firms receive total benefits equal to around 50% of their pay. State and local government workers are in between. They're around 58%. So what we know, but we know a certain amount about the salaries. The benefits haven't been analyzed as much, but the gap on the benefit end is, if anything, larger than the gap on the salary end. Next slide, please. So to sum up where we are so far, we have a salary premium of around 14%, a benefits premium of around 32%. If you combine those, you say, what's total paid compensation? The federal premium comes out around 26%. What this means is federal employees receive total annual compensation around 26% higher than similar private sector employees working at large firms. If you looked at small firms or average firms, it would be a larger premium. But there's another factor we wanted to look at, which is job security. And people are more conscious of this now because of the recession. In the private sector, according to the BLS, there's around a 20% chance for any given employee to be fired or laid off in a given year. In the federal sector, it's only around a 6% chance. So essentially, you have 3 times greater chance of sort of involuntarily losing your job in the private sector than you would in the federal government. For state and local workers, it's also right around 6%, just coincidentally. Now, people know job security has a value, but it's hard to put a dollar figure to it. But it's actually, it's possible to do this using the tools of financial economics. Could you go to the next slide, please? This gets a little bit complicated, and I'll give you an example. I'll start with a very, very simple example that is used in these sorts of things. Let's say I offered you a lump sum of $100,000 with a 50% chance of getting it, meaning you'd have a 50% chance of getting $100,000 or a 50% chance of getting nothing. And I say, what guaranteed amount could I give you that you would take, in preference to that? Some people might say, well, a 50% chance of getting $100,000 is $50,000, so I'll take 50 grand. In reality, though, most people will take much less than $50,000 to get the guaranteed amount because they're what you call risk averse. They don't like the variability in the risk. They would accept less than that in order to get the guaranteed amount. The same things apply with employment. It's just a little bit more complicated to figure them out. Just to give you an example, if I offered you a $100,000 private sector salary, but it came with the private sector's 20% chance of losing your job in that year, what lower salary would you accept in order to reduce that 20% chance of losing your job down to 6%? So we're playing with sort of risk here and saying, how much is that extra job security worth it to you? Now, there's ways you can figure this out, but it depends on answering a number of questions. This is one area we're still at the kind of preliminaries of it, and we're trying to quantify things, but the basic logic of this holds. What you want to know is what is the probability of being discharged in the different sectors. We know on average in the private sector it's around 20% chance of being fired or laid off in a year. In private sector it's around 6%, but we could say if federal employees were in the private sector because they're more skilled, more educated, maybe they'd have a lower than 20% chance of being laid off in a year. You also want to know what is the length of unemployment for people. On average, over the past 9 years or so, the average duration of unemployment if you lose your job is around 19 weeks. Today it's actually around 35, 36 weeks. But we could also say maybe federal employees, if they were in the private sector, would have a different duration of unemployment than the average person. On the one hand, they're more educated, so it might be easier for them to find a job. On the other hand, though, in the private sector, more educated people often tend to take a longer time to find a new job because they're looking for a new job with higher pay. We also want to say, well, if you're in the private sector and you're laid off, you can get unemployment benefits during the time you're laid off. So your income doesn't go to nothing if you lose your job. It goes down to whatever unemployment would pay. For these examples, I used $380 a week because that's the maximum amount you can get if you're in Maryland or Virginia. It will differ from state to state, but we're approximating it here. You also want to know if you lose your federal job and you have to find a new job in the private sector, is that new job going to pay the same amount that your old job did? Well, based on what we've seen in terms of the salary and benefits premium for federal workers, the best guess is that it won't. You actually would have to take a pay cut once you go back into the private sector because that's what your skills and experience would tend to get you. I assumed here that there's a total of 26% federal premium in terms of salaries and benefits. Finally, you want to know what is the individual's level of risk aversion. What this means is different people are willing to take different levels of risk, and the more risk-averse people value that job security more and will be willing to take a lower salary in order to get it. There's actually survey data where they ask people about their risk aversion, and it turns out public employees are much more risk-averse than the typical private sector worker. And that would kind of figure. They're attracted to work that offers a lot of stability. So given all this, we can calculate what the job security pay premium is. In other words, we can say how much of a pay cut would a typical federal worker be willing to take to have the federal level of job security versus the much higher level of insecurity that you get in the private sector. The answer to that is around 29%, which is a huge amount. It's a huge amount. So what we did is we said, okay, well let's back that assumption back a bit. Let's assume instead of federal workers being essentially the same as private sector workers, let's assume that they have half the probability of being unemployed as private sector workers and half the duration of unemployment, meaning they would only be unemployed for about 10 weeks or 9 weeks rather than 19 weeks. Even then, the pay premium associated with job security is around 9%. So even if you really scale back these assumptions a lot, you have a significant pay premium. This tells you that were federal workers to go into the private sector, they would probably be willing to accept a larger pay reduction in order to get that. So this is something we're continuing to work on. I think we can get better quality data on how federal workers would do in the private sector, but what we're looking at here is sort of an approximation. Can you go? Oh, okay. This is a different issue that I just wanted to touch on because it comes up in discussions a fair bit before we wrap up. That a lot of people sometimes point out that federal employees quit their jobs at much lower rates than private sector workers. And it is true. I think it's around, the quit rate for federal workers is around 1/3 that of the private sector. Now, most people would say, okay, well, that probably means they may not love their jobs, they're not seeing better opportunities out there. This might mean that the overall package they're getting in the federal government, be it salaries, benefits, job security, work conditions, the whole deal, is better than what they would otherwise find in the private sector. A low quit rate would tend to give you a hint that they're not drastically underpaid like OPM claims. There is a counter argument, though. There was an academic paper done in the 80s that said that the low quit rates you see with federal workers aren't a result of generous compensation, the result of the fact that federal workers have defined benefit pensions. The way DB pensions work is your later years of employment are where the pension really, really pays off, just because of the way the formulas are structured. So the argument there was because federal workers have defined benefit pensions, it locks them into their jobs. But this paper back in the 1980s said, well, the interesting experiment would be to see if federal workers got defined contribution pensions instead, their quit rates should go up. You know, once this job lock from the pensions were removed, quit rates for federal employees should go up. As it happens, in the 1980s, a big switch was made for federal pensions. Instead of having all your pension come from a defined benefit plan under CSRS, under the new system, FERS, you get part of your benefit from a DB plan, part from the thrift savings plan, which is like a 401k. So the lock-in effects of defined benefit pensions are a lot smaller for workers under FERS than they were for workers under the prior system. Given this logic, you should see higher quit rates today than you did in the past. In fact, though, I looked at data for 2007, and I compared it to data in 1984, and I looked at younger workers, so I was restricting to workers who would be under the new pension system. Quit rates in 2007 were around 30% lower than they were for similar age workers back in 1984. And we chose 2007 because we wanted a year in which the unemployment rate was very similar to what you had in 1984. The unemployment rates, you know, if unemployment is very high, nobody's going to quit. So we wanted to use, if we did it today, it wouldn't quite match. But we used 2007, so we have very close matching years, and the quit rate, instead of being higher, is actually lower. So, you know, I'm not arguing that pensions don't contribute to low quit rates for federal workers, but clearly there's something else going on there. We're arguing that part of that something else is generous compensation. Can you go to the next slide, please? So to sum things up, Jason outlined a salary premium of around 14%. I showed a federal benefit premium of around 32%, and a job security premium, I think, upwards of 9%. 9% was my kind of lowball premium on that. When you add it all together, you get a total compensation premium of around 37%. Now, if you have 2.5 million federal workers, I guesstimated that the total annual overcompensation could top $100 billion. So what this tells you is, you know, on the one hand, you're not going to balance the budget by reducing pay and compensation for federal employees. You know, that's not going to solve our problem. Our problem is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those sorts of things. On the other hand, $100 billion is real money. Moreover, there's been a lot of research done on how other countries have addressed their budget problems, OECD, IMF, World Bank. One of the things they found is that countries that have successfully gotten on top of their budget problems have often included reforms to public sector pay as part of the process. And that's a way of establishing credibility that the government's willing to take on tough issues. It also tells people out there, you know, who are going to get lower Social Security or Medicare payments, that there isn't some class of people who are sort of protected against these kinds of sacrifices. By sharing the pain and showing some credibility, it gives people more confidence that the problems are going to be gotten on top of. So, you know, $100 billion is not going to fix our budget problems, but it's not chicken feed either. One more slide. Jason mentioned this before, that, you know, the president has proposed a pay freeze. Other people, Republicans, have proposed even larger pay freezes or across-the-board cuts. A pay freeze for a couple of years probably isn't going to hurt anything. It's going to tend to take levels down a little bit closer to where they would be in the private sector. But as Jason pointed out, some federal workers are really overpaid, others are underpaid. You don't want to use an across-the-board approach if you can avoid it. An alternate approach is basically the idea of what they call job queues. I mean, there's evidence, we didn't even have a slide on this, but there's evidence that there's more demand for federal jobs than there is for private sector jobs. When a federal job opens up, it tends to get more applicants than a similar private sector job. But we can use this process to get a feeling for how much we should pay for jobs. If an agency is advertising a job and they're getting 100 applications for each job opening, that may mean they're paying too much. Alternately, if they're not getting enough job applications or they can't get the qualified people they need, they should be able to raise their pay. So it's trying to get some market signals in here for what people want and what do you have to do to attract them. One final thing is, I think in terms of the research going forward, it will be good to get a survey of newly hired federal employees. This is something which I think Congress could ask, say, the GAO to do. And ask newly hired employees, what are you getting in your current job versus the salary and the benefits that you had in your prior job? Back in 1999 and 2000, there was a survey done by the Post Office, which is a specialized area with its own issues, but they asked their employees, what is your current salary they're newly hired employees, what is your current salary versus what you got right before you came into the Postal Service? On average, new hires to the Postal Service got a 32% increase in salary, and obviously on top of that, you're going to get much, much more generous benefits and job security. That kind of thing, I think, is pretty visible evidence that there is a pay premium there in the federal government. I would not think you would get that big a pay premium over the federal government as a whole, because the post office tends to have people with lower skills, a very labor-intensive job. That said, this kind of research, I think, will be really helpful for policymakers of thinking that what they want to do about federal pay going forward. I think with that, we can end it. We're certainly happy to take any questions you have, and I thank you very much for your patience.
Does the pay freeze apply to step increases as well as the cost of living? No, it only applies to cost of living.
Okay. And to follow up on that, typically, what is the average percent increase due to a step change?
No.
3%? And then what percent of federal employees typically get a step increase in a given year?
I don't know.
25 a given year?
There have been, I've seen some calculations on the pay freeze of what they think the increase in pay, increase in salaries could be, due to step increases and things like that. I don't recall the number off my head. But clearly there's two things. One part is not going on anymore, the general across the board pay increases, but the step increases are still going on. But I don't know the exact amount that could raise pay.
And the reason somebody would not get a step increase is because they're at the highest step in their grade?
Other questions? Sure.
When you were talking about the benefits and you were talking about retirement benefits, you only used the employer cost for the defined benefit and the defined contribution. It costs the federal government more than a private employer to provide the same amount of post-employment benefit because the federal government is restricted in how it can invest the money it saves for retirement. Did you take that into account? I mean, given that you made your presentation only in terms of the employer cost for the benefit rather than the post-retirement salary replacement is somewhat misleading in the federal context.
Repeat.
Okay, the question is that the federal government invests its pension reserves differently than other pensions might. So does that would affect the cost of the pension, the measured cost of the pension? Does that give a misleading view of pension compensation? In general, no, because what I did is I adjusted there's two answers to it. One is it doesn't, because I adjusted the employer compensation for the rate of return they can expect to get on the employer contributions to get at an accurate view of what the employees will get.
I thought you said you used OMB's A76 formula for employer cost per employee.
I did, but you have to, let's say your employer gives you $1 of contributions to your 401k. Now if you want to, you can invest that however you want, but if you want to get a riskless return, a guaranteed rate of return on that, you're going to have to invest in U.S. Treasury bonds. They return around 4% on average. If you're in a defined benefit plan, be it federal or state or local, your benefits are effectively guaranteed, but you're getting a much higher rate of return on that money. In a state and local plan, it's very extreme. They promise benefits based on the assumption they're going to get an 8% return on their money. Now, maybe they'll get 8%, maybe they won't, but you're still guaranteed that benefit. So we have to adjust for that fact. We just have to say the employer is putting in a certain amount of money today, which they are assuming is going to grow at 8%, and that's producing a benefit at retirement. So we have to adjust for that, which is what I did. With the federal pensions, the rate of return is around 6.25% that they assume. So they're assuming for FERS, that is it.
Not the defined benefit.
That's the 6.25 is the discount rate.
I don't think you're right, but
Okay. If you want to email me with the answer, but I went to their actuarial report. I mean, the 6.25 is high. It's they're
no, 6.25 is too high, and I just think it accounts for a big part of the numbers you came up with.
it accounts for actually not a ton of it. I mean, it does. This gets into a technical issue. One of the limitations when you're looking at benefits is we know what the employer pays for the benefits. What we want to know is what the employee is receiving. That's what we care about. What will the employee receive? To do it, you have to adjust for the rate of return on the pensions. So the different rate of returns may alter the employer costs. By the adjustments I'm doing, you're getting an accurate picture of the employee benefit. So the budgetary stuff may come out differently. But feel free to email me. I mean, I'll send you more details. Sure.
Another question on that. But that's less important than what the government actually pays for the pension. Because if you're growing, because of you're investing the money, that doesn't cost the government.
Well, you want it, well, okay, here we got a question. Let's say the government could somehow more efficiently provide pension benefits than the private sector could. So it could provide every employee with, say $1,000 a month at retirement, but the federal government could do it more cheaply than the private sector could do it. Then you say, okay, well, there's this extra money lying around because the federal government's so much more efficient. Then there's the question of who should get that. If that extra money goes to the employees through higher benefits, then they're getting higher benefits than they'd otherwise receive. You could argue, well, it's not coming at extra cost to the taxpayer, but they would still be getting higher benefits. As it happens, no economist believes the government is more efficient at providing these benefits than the private sector. It's just, I mean, this is playing into an issue in terms.
How about, you used to work for the Social Security Administration, Mr. Biggs, and you know that the Social Security Administration does provide this benefit to all Americans at a very low overhead.
Okay,
More
let's.
efficiently than the private sector does, and you stand up there and say that don't.
Okay, let me clarify. I made an error in terms of what I said. In terms of administrative costs, defined benefit pensions have advantages over defined contribution pensions. They're lower administrative costs. When we talk about those issues are tiny compared to differences in assumed rates of return on investment. Those are massive factors. I'll say that no economist believes that the government can simply take more risk and produce benefits more efficiently accounting for risk. So this is not, if we did not do any of these adjustments, the basic outcomes of this presentation will be exactly the same. It's a factor that I think has to be accounted for to get it right. It is not at all the deciding factor in these conclusions. We will have, just to note, we are hoping to have it today, but it's got a bit more involved. We're going to have a working paper out soon that's going to run through all of this, and I'm confident that will hold up very, very well. Yes.
Would your model suggest that congressional staffers are overpaid by 37%? That's a serious question.
I don't know. It's, you would have to look very, I don't know if you have a category for that.
I guess I'm not familiar with congressional staffers as much as I should be in terms of their education. My impression is that congressional staffers tend to be highly educated, in which case you would have a lower premium than the average would be.
But they would still likely be overpaid using their model.
I don't want to make that claim right now because I have to look at them specifically.
I don't know. I mean, just my own experience from working on the Hill, I just think there's a ton of variation there. You get a lot of people. I mean, I don't want to say what the chief of staff makes, 150. You get a lot of people where I say, okay, on the outside, would he be making 150? But then you get other people who come and say, let this guy be a zillionaire on the outside, but he's doing public service. I think in congressional staff in particular, there's more variation than you might get elsewhere.
Well, you would also want to look at the turnover rate of congressional staff.
It's pretty high, I imagine.
You're right. That's a tricky kind of, and a lot of that's involuntary. Well, they get better deals.
Actually, that actually presents a good experiment, right? Because if your congressman loses, you've lost your job for no fault of your own, right? And it'd be interesting to see what kind of job you get after that. Because if there's a huge increase there in wages, then...
Well, if you get a lobbying job, then you get a problem.
It depends on what occupation you go into.
The question there would be, I mean, if you go work for a congressman or a committee for a long time, you can come out of that and make a lot more than you did working on the Hill. But the question is, if you didn't have that Hill experience, will you make that much? And the answer is probably no.
Well, the only option isn't just being a lobbyist. The other one is just to leave Washington altogether.
Sure.
And go back where you came from.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be a good thing to. But the sort of, at the big picture level, the fixed effects model, or the model that Jason discussed, we follow people over time, was designed to get at that. where it says, well, we don't know everything about people through these different variables, so we follow the same person over time. If they find a new job in the federal government versus finding a new job in the private sector, what is the pay difference? And you're finding consistently that people who find a new job in the federal government are getting a boost over those who find a new job in the private sector. They'll both tend to get pay increases because people tend to get a new job when they get a raise, but the raise is bigger if you find a new federal job. And that's not even accounting for the benefits.
That's correct.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
how would the premium be affected if the federal government moved away from defined benefit pension plans and towards a defined contribution plan?
If they just eliminated the DB plan, what you call the normal cost for the federal pensions, either around 14% of payroll. That's combining the old CSRS service, which was really expensive, with the new FERS, which is around 12% of payroll. If you just shut it down and you said, okay, you froze the pension and nobody's getting anything more going forward, then that 14% cost would be gone, and then you'd save that money. If you instead said, we're going to take 14% of wages, put it extra money into the TSP, then you don't save anything. So it really depends on what the alternate outcome is.
Will the paper that you published disaggregate the workers into groups, like you said, the higher skilled workers have no negative premiums and low
I think,
premiums?
can we do that?
The question is, will we disaggregate the
Sorry.
workers into different education classes and experience classes? And that is part of the plan. We have this working paper that we keep intending to publish tomorrow, and then we come up with some new approach or new data set comes about we want to modify the results with. But we do hope to have that posted, I guess, on the AEI website within the next couple of weeks. By the way, do they have our email addresses? Is that something on? I don't know.
No, they do have the RSVP email address everybody got, so if you have other questions, you can
So
follow along.
first name dot last name at organization dot org. Yeah.
Sure.
I have a question about the data you use when you do the individual comparisons.
Sure.
Are all college degrees equal? A BA or a BS in chemistry from one school is equal to another? And the next question, just sort of a related question, is the data you use reported by those individuals?
Okay, the first question was, when you control for education in a CPS, can you distinguish between sort of high quality education at a certain level and low quality? And the second question was, do people report these incomes themselves, or is it someone else reporting them?
And their characteristics.
Oh, and their other characteristics. As the first question, no. Unfortunately, in terms of what we control for education by years of education. So it's sort of a typical issue faced by anyone doing a regression like this, where if someone's from Harvard and someone is from a third-tier school, you cannot distinguish between those two things. One of the ways that we try to sort of address that problem, again, is with the longitudinal analysis that we mentioned before, where you're comparing within person. And by that I mean you're following the same person over time. So you're able to control for things that are you're less able to observe in the cross-sectional model. As for how the CPS operates, it is typically the people themselves reporting what their income is. But they also have, it's a pretty elaborate system at this point, computer operated, that does a pretty good job at getting accurate information. If someone says they make $5 million a year and they're a high school dropout, the computer will flag that and say, hey, that doesn't look right, and tell the interviewer to, well, right. And so, generally speaking, we tend to believe the numbers that we get.
You could do this with Social Security Administration data, where you match it to the earnings records. I don't know any studies that have done it, but it's doable. I doubt you get different results. You'd have to get very different results. You'd have to assume the errors are skewed, and I'm sure there's errors in there, but I think they're fairly random. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it.